Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, YouTube. This is Jayvardy, doing another decade video. Today I'm going to discuss my top 10 disappointing movies of the decade from 2010 to 2019. So before we start with the countdown, let's get into a few rules and reminders for this video. Number one, and this is important, just because a movie makes the list doesn't mean I dislike it. Most of the movies on this list I do dislike, but there are a couple movies that disappointed me in other ways. Not that I necessarily disliked or hated the movie, but they disappointed me in other ways, and that leads into number two. Disappointing can be defined many ways. Disappointing can mean you're disappointed in how it was received by the public, or I was disappointed in what the movie led to in the future, or simply I disliked it when I wanted to love it, or I was neutral about it when I wanted to love it. All these things can mean disappointed. Disappointing is a vast term, and it's defined many ways, and it will be defined many ways in this video list. Number three, I reserve the right to one tie position. That means that there are more than 10 movies in the top 10 list because one of the spots will be reserved for a tie. I like to do this for a lot of my lists. So I reserve the right to have one of the positions in the top 10 be for a tie. Number four, my list, not yours or the mainstream. So this is my list. It's not going to be the same as your list. It's not going to be the same as the mainstream list, whether that be WatchMojo or any other major YouTube celebrities that do these types of videos. This is my list. It's not going to be the same as theirs. It's not going to be the same as yours. Feel free to let me know your list in the comments below, but before you get upset with this list, remember that it's just my list. It will be different from yours, so don't get too upset about it. That being said, let's count down the top 10 most disappointing movies from the decade of 2010 to 2019. Alright, so let's start with numbers 10 through 7. Coming in at number 10, Dragon Ball Z Battle of Gods. Now, I grew up as a huge fan of Dragon Ball, huge fan of Dragon Ball Z. I have every single season of Dragon Ball on DVD. I have every single season of Dragon Ball Z on DVD. I have every single season of Dragon Ball GT on DVD. And I have several of the non-canon films of DBZ on DVD, including this one, Battle of Gods. And I also have the Dragon box sets that has the original Japanese version of Dragon Ball Z. I have all of those on DVD as well. I'm a huge DBZ fan, and I've collected everything there is to collect virtually that you can get from the series. Dragon Ball Z Battle of Gods, it had a lot of hype as being the return of Akira Toriyama, the creator of Dragon Ball, who was not involved with Dragon Ball GT or had very little involvement in Dragon Ball GT, if any. But he came back to do this movie. It was supposed to take place after the Buu saga and be an alternate timeline to that of Dragon Ball GT, or to begin an alternate timeline of Dragon Ball GT. Now, I had a lot of questions when I watched Dragon Ball Z Battle of Gods. Let me make something clear. First of all, I did not go see this movie in movie theaters, and I didn't watch this movie till about a year, maybe 2 years after it first came out. But I had a lot of questions when I watched Battle of Gods. My first question was, where is Oob? Why isn't he in this movie? Dragon Ball Z ended with Goku and Oob flying off from the World Martial Arts Tournament. Where is Oob? They didn't even mention him in the movie. It just seems strange to me that Dragon Ball Z ended with Goku and Oob leaving from the World Martial Arts Tournament, and here we have Goku training on King Kai's planet all of a sudden, and which also struck me as kind of a weird decision as well. Why is Goku training with King Kai on King Kai's planet? Dragon Ball Z is very specific in terms of this is where they are at this point of the show, this is where they are at this point of the show, this is where they are at this point of the show. Now, Dragon Ball Z has a steady evolvement in terms of power level and what they need to do to train to get stronger for Goku, Vegeta, and Gohan. So he was backtracking in this movie to something that he's far more advanced in. I don't mind it in terms of story, but in terms of logic, it didn't really make much sense. Now, for the movie itself, I didn't really like Beerus as a villain, and I know he becomes a major character in the show Dragon Ball Super, but I didn't really like the character, to be honest. I didn't really like the concept of the character, you know, the god of destruction or the planet destroyer, whatever. I also didn't really buy into the fact that he was above Frieza in a hierarchy that, ties him back to earlier parts of Dragon Ball Z, and he, actually told Frieza to blow up Planet Vegeta or approve the destruction of Planet Vegeta. To me, that's all just BS, and there's a lot of playing around with canon in this movie, and to me it came off as really bush league, very amateurish, even though it was Akira Toriyama doing it. I don't like seeing series retroactively playing with canon from the past. Why not just make something new? Just make a new story. It's not that hard. Not everything has to be tied together, but that's a different discussion for a different video. In terms of the movie itself, like I just didn't have a lot of fun with it. There wasn't a whole lot of character moments in this movie that I didn't already see from these characters in the television show or in other movies. It didn't offer me any sort of excitement, and the new power up of the Super Saiyan God or Super Saiyan God mode, whatever you call it, I didn't find it to be an epic power up. Dragon Ball Z is known for its epic power ups, and I was really disappointed with how Goku became a Super Saiyan God. I thought it was kind of lame, to be honest. Just overall, not a big fan of this from a guy who is a massive Dragon Ball fan. And no, I have not watched Dragon Ball Super. I've seen clips of it here and there. I've read bits of it here and there, but I'm just not interested, to be honest. Number 9, Interstellar. Now, this was Christopher Nolan's first movie post the Dark Knight trilogy. Now, Christopher Nolan is a magnificent filmmaker. He is one of the best filmmakers alive today, and anybody who works in the industry can only aspire to be half as good as Christopher Nolan. To be even half as good as he is would be a massive accomplishment. And I don't just mean in success-wise, I mean talent-wise. Now, Christopher Nolan to me has 4 amazing movies, 4 great to amazing movies, and that's Batman Begins, that's The Dark Knight, that's Inception, and that's Memento. And those all came before Interstellar, so the hype for this was insane. And this goes back to my rules of just because a movie's on this list doesn't mean I dislike it. I don't dislike Interstellar. I own it on Blu-ray. I quite enjoy it, to be honest. It just wasn't to the level of those other 4 movies that I just mentioned. It's not as good as Memento. It's not as good as Inception. It's not as good as The Dark Knight. It's not as good as Batman Begins. To me, it's not even on their level, to be completely honest. Those 4 movies I could watch 2-3 times a year and enjoy them each time I watch them. Interstellar is a movie I would like to watch maybe once every 3 or 4 years. Still a good movie, still enjoyed it. I really like Matthew McConaughey as an actor too. He really revived his career in this decade, 2010 to 2019. Really turned his career around, and Interstellar is one of the movies that helps the turning of that career. But for me, I was a little bit disappointed because I was expecting something on the level of Memento and Inception, and that is not a knock against Christopher Nolan, that is praise to him, that when he puts out a new movie, you expect the highest level of quality possible. And to me, we didn't quite get that in Interstellar, but it's still a good movie, but I am disappointed in it because it wasn't at the level of an Inception or of a Memento, and that is praise to Christopher Nolan. Number 8 and number 7, The Desolation of Smaug and the Battle of Five Armies. Now, I actually have it right here. I'm just going to pull it off the shelf. This is my favorite novel of all time, The Hobbit. I don't do a whole ton of reading, but this is my favorite novel of all time, favorite fictional novel of all time anyways. And the first movie was basically this book come to life. Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey was basically this book, or the first third of the book, because they split it into 3 movies, come to life. I really felt like when I watched the first movie, I was seeing this book, which I enjoy and read before I saw the movies, come to life on the big screen, and it was wonderful. These two took a completely different direction from the book. It's the same story, but not the same story, and anyone who's read the book knows what I mean. And they're not even as good as the first movie either. Now, even if you consider it, the movies and the books separate, these 2 movies aren't at the level of quality of the first movie, even if you just disregard the book's existence. But I don't disregard the book's existence. The Desolation of Smog is lower than the Battle of Five Armies because the Desolation of Smog, the best way for me to describe it is this. As a fan of the book, I hate the movie. As a fan, if you disregard the book though and you just judge the movie on its own merits, it's not garbage. I'm not going to say it's good, but it's not garbage. It is watchable if you disregard the book. But because I can't disregard the book, I get pissed off every time I watch The Desolation of Smog. But the reason why the Battle of Five Armies is above it is because that movie's just unwatchable, period. Whether you're a fan of the book, whether you disregard the book, whatever. The movie's just bad, just straight up bad. And that's why the Battle of Five Armies is higher than the Desolation of Smog. But the reason they're both on this list is because I love the book, I love the first movie, and it's really disappointing to me that I can only really watch the first movie and it feels like it's incomplete because the next two parts are terrible. And as a fan of the book, it breaks my heart and really disappoints me because I would love nothing more than to watch one whole story on screen that is faithful to this book to the level that the first movie was, but unfortunately we don't have that, and that's why the Battle of Five Armies and the Desolation of Smog are on my top 10 most disappointing movies of the decade. Right, this side of the board is going to cause some controversy, but don't worry, we'll get there. Listen to my explanation and you'll understand why it's there. But before we get to it, start off with number 6, and that is Justice League. Now, the Justice League, I don't hate the movie, but I don't love it either. And that's what disappoints me the most, is I wanted to love this movie. I'm a huge DC guy. If you watch my top 10 comic book movies of the decade video, which is on my channel, you can watch it now, I had Batman v Superman on that list. I had Man of Steel on that list, and I had Wonder Woman on that list. This was a huge step back, in my opinion. Now, the biggest problem with Justice League to me is that everything is rushed in it. Every single moment is rushed. The moment of Superman coming back to life was rushed. And I don't even like the way they handled Superman coming back to life either. In the movie, the Justice League has to revive Superman, but at the end of Batman v Superman, you see the dirt rising off the top of the coffin, indicating that Superman is still alive. Which I thought that going into Justice League, that Superman would make his return to save the Justice League at the last moment. Kind of a cliche idea, I know, but cliches sometimes work, and it would have been a really epic moment to see the Justice League facing an obstacle they couldn't overcome, and last second Superman comes in to save the day. It would have been a lot better than what we got. I didn't like the whole concept of Justice League having to revive Superman. I thought it was handled poorly, and everything around that was handled poorly. Superman was evil when he was first resurrected. When he first was resurrected, he was evil, but that was very rushed. He was evil for about one scene. He's being reunited with Lois Lane, that was rushed. We saw them for about 10 seconds, and then all of a sudden, we're moved on. We've moved on from that moment. His being reunited with his mom, again, we see it for one scene that lasts about 1 minute, and then they just move on. It was just a very rushed movie, and I didn't really like any of the new characters in the team. Like, I thought The Flash was okay, I thought Aquaman was okay, but they didn't really do enough with those characters to make me love them, to be honest. Like, Aquaman, you didn't even really see him be Aquaman. He was on land for the entire movie. Everything involved in the final battle was on land. You didn't even really get to see Aquaman use his specific powers in his environment in the movie, which, why have Aquaman in the movie if you're not going to use him, in Aqua? But anyways, I don't hate the movie, but it was disappointing in a lot of ways. And I could talk about Justice League for hours, but to be honest, I just don't want to because it disappoints me. Suicide Squad is also on this list, and Suicide Squad is just terrible. The whole movie is just terrible, which is really disappointing because I really, really liked Man of Steel, and I really, really liked Batman v Superman, and I really liked the trailers for Suicide Squad. I was really pumped for it, but the whole movie was just bad, and specifically Jared Leto and Margot Robbie, they butchered their characters. The Joker, Jared Leto should be embarrassed for his portrayal of the Joker, and I'm sure he is now that we've seen Joaquin Phoenix, but to follow up Heath Ledger the way he did should have been an embarrassment, and then to have Joaquin Phoenix come after and to show him how it's done, that should also be an embarrassment. And Margot Robbie, I'm sorry, that's not Harley Quinn. Harley Quinn doesn't give motivational speeches. She doesn't, she's not a leader in her group. She's not, just everything about her character was wrong. Just because, she says Mr. J and she has a high-pitched, bubbly personality doesn't mean she's actually being Harley Quinn. That moment in the bar when Harley talks about the Suicide Squad being her friends and she gives them a motivational speech, that is not her character. It will never be her character. I don't know why that was in the movie, why the writer thought that was a good idea. Just completely butchered everything about Harley Quinn and the Joker. And the rest of the movie was pretty boring and, didn't really offer anything to the DC universe as a whole. So just a really bad movie that is my number 5 most disappointed movie of the decade. Number 4 is Amazing Spider-Man 2. Now, Amazing Spider-Man 1 is one of my favorite comic book movies of all time. I don't hate this movie. I don't even necessarily dislike it. I think the tone is all over the place. This is, to me, is the Return of the Jedi of Spider-Man movies. And what I mean by that is half the movie is great and half the movie is terrible. Just like with Return of the Jedi, half the movie is great, Luke, Vader, and the Emperor. Half the movie is terrible. The slow and boringness of Tatooine and the Ewoks on Endor. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is pretty much the Return of the Jedi of Spider-Man movies. Everything involving Peter and Gwen is good. Everything involving Peter and Harry is good. But everything involving Electro is terrible, and everything involving Aunt May is pretty bad too. There's one scene with Aunt May that I thought was okay, and that's the scene in the bedroom where she tells the truth about Peter's father, or the truth as she knows it. But everything else with her in that movie is just kind of cringe. So again, half great, half terrible. But what disappoints me the most is how the public responded to it. And what disappoints me the most is we never got a third movie with Andrew Garfield, who I think is the best Spider-Man and best Peter Parker we've ever had on the big screen. Even though the second movie isn't great, I still think he's the best Peter Parker and best Spider-Man. And it disappoints me that we never got a third movie. It disappoints me that this movie didn't do better than it did. And it disappoints me that half the movie is terrible. Now, number 3. I don't hate this movie. I don't love it. I don't love Avengers Endgame, but I don't hate it. This is what disappoints me about it. I am disappointed that they erased Infinity War in 1 year in the real world, not in the fictional world. I know in the fictional world it takes place 5 years later, but that's the point. If in the fictional world it's taking place 5 years later, why didn't we get this movie 5 years later in real life, or even 3 years later in real life? I could have lived with that. But to erase what Infinity War did in 1 year was disappointing to me. I would have loved to see that movie be the end of the MCU, or the perceived end of the MCU, for 3 to 5 years. The MCU could have still pumped out movies in that timeline, but that would have been even better and more epic. Why not have 3 to 5 years worth of movies taking place in the post-Thanos MCU? Why can't we see, an Ant-Man movie that takes place in the post-Thanos MCU before Avengers Endgame? Why couldn't we see a Captain America movie that takes place in the post-Thanos MCU before Avengers Endgame? These movies would have made money, and it would have added even more to the build-up to Avengers Endgame, and it would have added more to the payoff of Infinity War. But instead, they had basically no movies taking place in between the between Infinity War and Endgame in real life, and they just rushed right from Infinity War to Endgame, which is what disappoints me, because it erased the ending of Infinity War, which is one of the greatest movie endings of all time, and they ruined it within 1 year. I would have liked to see the MCU have 3 years or 5 years in real life of movies that takes place post-Infinity War and before Endgame. I don't understand why they couldn't have done it. There's only one explanation, in my opinion, and that's that Sony wanted to do another Spider-Man movie with Tom Holland, and they didn't want to wait 3 years to make it. That's pretty much the best explanation for it. Or maybe the contracts of Chris Evans and Robert Downey Jr. didn't extend for another 3 to 5 years, and they couldn't wait to do Endgame that many years later or whatever. But the point is, I don't dislike this movie, and in fact, I actually would have quite enjoyed it if it took place in reality, not in the fictional world, in reality, 3 to 5 years from now. It would have made it more epic. And they can go ahead and make movies in between Infinity War and Endgame, but it doesn't mean anything now because we already know what happens. Avengers Endgame completely overdid Infinity War. The Infinity War, it's not relevant anymore in the world of story. It's relevant in real life, but not in the world of story. And I just wish that they would have matched the fictional timeline and real life timeline better and waited a few years to do Avengers Endgame. Then I wouldn't have disliked the movie as much as I did. I disliked it because I was upset that they ruined the beautiful ending of Avengers Infinity War so soon. And one of my favorite trilogies of all time is the Jason Bourne trilogy with Matt Damon. The Bourne Identity, the Bourne Supremacy, and the Bourne Ultimatum are awesome. I love that trilogy. I watch it at least once a year. And that is why number 2 for me is Jason Bourne. Now when Jason Bourne first came out, I was really excited because I was excited to have an official 4th movie of the Bourne series. They did have the Bourne Legacy with Jeremy Renner, but this movie kind of basically ignored that movie's existence. And to me, that is actually one of the problems of this movie, and we'll get to it. But one of the major problems, first off the bat, was they weren't adapting any of the Bourne novels for this movie. This was going to be a 100% original story that is not based on any of the novels, where the Bourne trilogy of Identity, Supremacy, and Ultimatum are based off of the actual Jason Bourne novels. This one was not. And Matt Damon had a hand in writing this, which I was excited about because, of course, Matt Damon is a great writer. He's written Good Will Hunting, and he has an Academy Award for writing. So I was excited to hear that he was going to be involved in it, but it also is kind of dangerous to have played a character and be emotionally connected to that character, and write for that character, but you're not the creator of that character. You're the guy who embodied him, but you're not the creator. And your vision of the character might be different than what the creator's vision of the character is. And that showed up in this movie. I was not a fan of any of the creative decisions they made in this movie. My girlfriend at the time, we were living together at the time, she's also a big fan of the Bourne series. One of the very first things we said about this movie before it came out was, if they kill Nikki to, make that the starting point of the story, the moment that sparks the events of this movie, that is just lame. Because she isn't murdered in the novels. Nikki is not murdered in the novels. And we were really skeptical that we were thinking that's what they were going to do. Not only did they do that, they had Nikki get killed really early in the movie, which is a creative choice that I disagree with, but it was basically irrelevant afterwards. Jason wasn't all that upset about it throughout the rest of the movie, and the plot really didn't revolve around that event at all. It was almost like they did it for the sake of doing it, but then they never did anything with it after it happened, which made it even worse. It was adding insult to injury. I just disliked this movie as a whole. I didn't like that Nikki was killed. I didn't like the whole concept of the CIA trying to bring Jason Bourne back into the fold while still trying to kill him like they were before. It was very weird. I've only watched the movie once because I'm just not a fan of it at all. I was very, very disappointed. It's my number 2 most disappointing movie of the decade. That says a lot. And the reason it's so disappointing is because I love the trilogy so much. I love the Jason Bourne trilogy. I really do. But one of the signs, and I'll say this, the number 1 sign of a movie being bad is when the audience is questioning the creative direction of the story. A movie needs to be immersive. You shouldn't be questioning why did this happen, why did that happen. You should be questioning what's going to happen next. You need to be immersed in the story, not questioning the story. And when you're sitting there questioning the story, you know you have a bad movie. And that is why that's number 2. And what's number 1 on this list? The whole questioning of the story, questioning of creative choices, it takes it to a complete another level. I didn't think we would get another one to the level of this, Jason Bourne level of questioning creative, at least for me personally. But number 1, they take it to a whole nother level with that. But I will say this, I love the Jason Bourne trilogy. I hated this movie. I wish it didn't happen. And when my ex was actually working the night that this came out. She had a job through her internship that she was working at the time, and I didn't really want to wait for her to go see it with her on a day off of hers. So what I said to her is, I'll go see it while you're at work, and if it's awesome, like the other 3 movies, we'll go see it next week together or whatever. But I told her that the movie was terrible, and I told her what happened. And because she asked me, just tell me what happened, and I told her, and the first thing she said was, I'm just going to pretend this movie doesn't even exist. And that's how I feel about it. And again, the whole, I'm just going to pretend this movie doesn't exist, number 1 takes that to a whole new level. So let's put down number 1. A 3-way tie. I said I reserved the right to 1 tie, and my top 10 most disappointing movies of the decade from 2010 to 2019 starts with The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, and The Rise of Skywalker, all being tied for number 1. Disney's Star Wars. We just talked about questioning a story instead of questioning what's going to happen next in the story. I question every creative choice they made in this whole trilogy. I question every single creative choice they made. Everything. From the names of the characters, from the events of the movie, from how they played around with Star Wars lore, how they changed the rules of canon. It's been talked about to death on YouTube. There is, half of the YouTube community who likes these movies, and then there's half of the community that despises these movies, and I'm on that half. And there are tons of video essays out there, there are tons of written essays out there on why these 3 movies are bad. It's been talked to death. I'm sure you've all have heard the points. Rey being a Mary Sue, blah, blah, blah. It's been talked to death. The point is, this killed my love for... If this movie killed my love for a franchise, this took it to a whole nother level. And the night I saw The Force Awakens, and this describes the Disney trilogy perfectly, I walked out of The Force Awakens, and I was trying hard to convince myself I liked it. But I knew I didn't. That same night, I knew I didn't. And I stayed up all night in bed, I could not sleep, because I was so depressed, is the best word to put it, about what just happened and what the Star Wars franchise just became. I knew with The Force Awakens, after seeing it, that it would never be the same again. And I actually took up a Star Wars boycott after The Force Awakens. Not after The Last Jedi, after The Force Awakens. But I decided to give The Last Jedi a chance because the trailers were amazing. That's one thing I'll say about the Disney Star Wars. The trailers are phenomenal. Whoever marketed those trailers, put those trailers together, that person deserves $1 million because they're among the greatest trailers of all time, and it was among one of the greatest marketing campaigns of all time for the whole trilogy, not just The Force Awakens. The Last Jedi had a great marketing campaign as well. But I decided to give The Last Jedi a chance because of the trailers being so good and because it was a different director from The Force Awakens. Now that's another thing. This whole trilogy is 2 different men trying to tell 2 different stories, and that's very obvious when you watch the trilogy. You have J.J. Abrams trying to do one thing in The Force Awakens, Rian Johnson doing something completely different in The Last Jedi, and then J.J. Abrams trying to fix The Last Jedi in The Rise of Skywalker. It's just a mess. But here's the thing, J.J. Abrams or Rian Johnson? Which one? Is JJ the right guy? Is Ryan the right guy? The answer is neither are the right guy. They're both terrible. I hated The Force Awakens. I was depressed for days after The Force Awakens. And when I saw The Last Jedi after giving it a shot, I pretty much was like, this franchise will just never be the same again. When I did a review that night, it's not online anymore, but when I did a review that night, I said, if you like The Force Awakens, you'll probably like this movie, but let's be honest, this franchise will never be the same again. And here we are. My number 1 most disappointing movie of the decade It's all three of The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, and The Rise of Skywalker. You killed my greatest and most favorite franchise from my childhood, Disney, and for that, I'll never forgive you for that. I will never forgive you for that, and this trilogy, for the rest of my life, will be something that I despise. Thank you for watching. That was my top 10 most disappointing movies of the decade. Please subscribe to this channel. This is youtube.com/Jayvardy. That's Jayvardy, youtube.com/Jayvardy. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and comment on this video what your most disappointing movies of the decade were. And if you like this video and you want to see future videos, please hit the like button. It'll help this channel out. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. I'm Jayvardy. That's it for today.